So, with the release of Lahairoi, we've gotten a lot of interesting lore and world building revealed to us. There have been many interesting things name dropped and left unexplored, such as Balder, Vendruga, and other Norse mythology, like Jormungandr, that I plan to make a whole entire separate video on. Some others, like Professor Anselm, seem to be named after the famous Anselm of Canterbury, who first proposed the ontological argument of God in the Proslogion, which matches really quite well the theory crafting we've already kind of gone through with Lahairoi. However, the most interesting name that has been revealed comes from Napolita, after you first finished a hologram challenge in the Rebel Academy with a high score. Within it, she recalls that the only other challenger to complete every difficulty level was a synchronous named Aemeath. Now, while this is really just a theory that you should take with a grain of salt, all the evidence available, as well as what we're going to go through in this video, seems to point towards the fact that the supposed pink-haired woman character that has caught everyone's attention from the drip marketing and the beginning of the 3.0 story is this mysterious Aemeath. If we are to look at teaser trailers of 3.0, we can see that Aemeath, if they really are her of course, seems to be a bit of a divine or somewhat supernatural being in a sense. They cause electronics to break and malfunction, and nobody, except for Rover, who is a de facto divine being themselves, are even able to sense their presence. And if we are to look into what Aemeath as a word actually means, then we can concur even further that this pink-haired woman, or whoever Aemeath actually really ends up being, is connected very heavily with the vaunted Exostrider. Aemeath is a word that, unsurprisingly, considering the whole region is named Lahairoi, draws very heavily from the Old Testament in the Bible. It seems to be a close analogue or transliteration of the Hebrew word Aemeth, or Aemeth, which roughly translates into meaning truthfulness and reliability. What's important to understand, however, is that the Hebrew concept of Aemeth is not like our modern rigid conception of truth. Aemeth is a sense of truth derived from the character and instruction of God, and as such is a deeply relational term. In a sense, you can take it as basically God's truth in a way. In modern times, we see truth as a state of objectivity. 1 plus 1 is a fact, the truth, because it is objectively correct. However, Aemeth is a truth that is fundamentally related to God, and as such is much more about performing actions faithfully according to his will, rather than a state of being. Aemeth is a truth about action, about doing, not being. And where Aemeth becomes really uncanny and beyond coincidence is when it comes to golems. Now, some of you may find it surprising that golems even appear in the Bible. After all, what we consider when we think of a golem in a modern sense is probably a bit distant from what it exactly is in Christian and Jewish scripture. The modern term golem comes from the Hebrew word golmi, which in English is now simply translated as unfinished substance or my raw form. However, if we look into Jewish folklore more, a golem is just a being created out of raw material, such as clay or mud, in the likeness of a human. Of course, it isn't actually human, and in order to make it move, someone must carve a specific word into it to give it power, being, you may have guessed, Aemeth. As such, this inanimate being of raw matter, under the gaze of God's truth, is essentially provided animation, or if you really want to push it, life. Aemeth as a word is interesting as well, because if you remove a single letter, Aemeth becomes Met, meaning death, which has been implied to mean that one can't live without the truth of God. Additionally, erasing the letter on a golem also deactivates it. However, what's interesting is also what letter exactly is erased. The word Aemeath takes from 3 letters, the beginning, the middle, and the end of the Jewish alphabet, which symbolizes completeness. Aleph, the beginning letter of the alphabet, symbolizes the beginning. And what's interesting is that Aleph is also the name that the scientists of Lahairoi give to the Frenodian of the region, Aleph 1. So perhaps removing Aleph from Aemeath, which results in death, can be something that is symbolic for the Frenodian later on. Now, all this talk about golems is really important because, of course, we have an enormous golem in Lahairoi, being the Exostrider. It is, in all intents and purposes, a golem. It's made up of inanimate material, and it is only given sentience when a human synchronous can control and awaken it from its slumber. Additionally, as we know, the Exostrider seems to exist as a sort of de facto sentinel replacement, which we get extra confirmation for since the Exostrider is called a sentinel analog by the Academy's researchers. Considering that Lahairoi symbolically seems to allude to a place where one's connection to divinity is tested, which you can check out here if you want a more in-depth explanation, the fact that Aemeath is the name of the best synchronous in the Academy's history seems to link to all of this very well. As we said before, Aemeath is not just an activation trigger for a golem, but a sort of truth, God's truth, a word that can turn an inanimate object active and sentient under the oversight and eyes of God. As such, Aemeath is a sort of activation trigger, an ignition key, if you will, both physically and spiritually. Just like how one has to carve the word Aemeath to activate a golem, perhaps it is the Academy's best synchronist, Aemeath, who is needed to truly activate the Exostrider from its slumber, so it can finally have its great confrontation with the Frenodian of Void, Aleph 1. Aemeath is also, as we've explored, a sort of divine being that seems to be omnipotent enough to only be visible to Rover, another divine being, as well as also being able to traverse through void and space. Since, as we explored, Aemeath as a concept is just intrinsically tied to the divine, to God and its truth. Perhaps Aemeath is more than just an ignition key, but what transforms an otherwise hunking piece of inanimate machinery and provides it divinity and godhood, so much so that the Exostrider Golem is labeled as a replacement sentinel, an artificial construct given godhood by Aemeath, who represents God's vision and truth. For all we know, the Exostrider and the echoes that are born from its components are really nothing more than bits and pieces of a machine. It is only when they are infused with a sort of divine power and truth that they can be given animation. So perhaps the pink-haired woman, or really, whoever Aemeath turns out to be, is more than just an ignition key. Perhaps they provide the spirit to the machine, provide a sort of divine will and life to what would otherwise be a gigantic hunk of metal.